Lieutenant Frances Callahan removed her uniform coat on a cold Okinawa night and placed it over the trembling body of a Japanese prisoner. The woman had not slept in 3 days. Military regulations forbade fraternization with enemy captives. Medical ethics demanded intervention. Between these two truths, Frances made a choice that would expose a pattern of systematic neglect written into the very structure of war itself. Okinawa, April 1945. The Battle of Okinawa had entered its bloodiest phase. Shuri Castle became the center of fierce combat between American forces and entrenched Japanese defenders. By April 12th, American casualties exceeded 15,000. Japanese losses reached catastrophic numbers. And somewhere in the chaos of artillery fire and desperate combat, the war's bureaucratic machinery struggled with a problem it had never adequately addressed: what to do with captured women. Field POW collection. Point 7B occupied a muddy plateau 3 miles behind the front lines. Barbed wire enclosures stretched across former farmland. Military tents housed interrogation stations, medical facilities, and administrative offices. By mid-April, the compound held 3,147 Japanese prisoners of war. The infrastructure had been designed with a single assumption: prisoners would be male. Lieutenant Frances Callahan arrived at the collection point on April 10th, one of 17 Army Nurse Corps officers assigned to provide medical screening for the growing prisoner population. At 27, Frances had already served in field hospitals in the Philippines and Guam. She had treated catastrophic injuries, performed triage under artillery fire, and witnessed more death than any person should experience in a lifetime. Her personnel file described her as competent, efficient, occasionally insubordinate when medical judgment conflicts with command directives. The Army Nurse Corps had been established in 1901, but nurses did not receive full military rank until 1947. In 1945, they existed in a liminal space: officers without command authority, medical professionals whose recommendations could be overruled by male administrators with no medical training. More than 59,000 women served in the Corps during World War II. Their official role was to care for American servicemen. The care of enemy prisoners fell into an institutional gray area. April 19th. Frances was conducting routine medical inspections when Corporal Daniel O'Brien approached her tent. "Lieutenant, we've got a situation. Transport just brought in civilians from the Shuri sector. 12 of them. They're women." Frances looked up from her medical log. In 6 weeks at the collection point, she had screened over 800 prisoners. All had been men. Where are they now? Commander Morrison ordered them separated from the main population. They're in the auxiliary tent near the western perimeter. The auxiliary tent had been used for equipment storage. Frances grabbed her medical kit and followed O'Brien across the compound. The 12 women sat on bare ground inside the tent. No cots, no blankets, no latrine facilities. They ranged in age from early 20s to perhaps 40. Their clothing was torn and mud-stained. Several showed visible injuries. All displayed the 1,000-yard stare of traumatic shock. She turned to O'Brien. "How long have they been here?" "Transport arrived 3 hours ago. Processing took about 90 minutes. Have they received water, food, medical screening?" The corporal shifted uncomfortably. "Commander said to secure them first." The interpreters tied up with intelligence interrogations. Nobody gave clear orders. This was the machinery of institutional neglect. Not malicious intent, but systemic blindness. The collection point had procedures for male prisoners. For women, there were no procedures. So they sat on cold ground while the bureaucracy slowly recognized their existence. Frances began examining the women methodically. 3 nurses, 2 radio operators, 2 whose functions remained unclear, 3 younger women who flinched at sudden movement. The last woman sat apart from the others, back against the tent pole, knees drawn to her chest. She was perhaps 24, small-framed, with hands that trembled continuously. Her pupils were dilated. Her breathing came in rapid, shallow cycles. When Frances approached, the woman did not appear to register her presence. "Corporal, I need that interpreter. Now. This woman is in medical crisis." O'Brien hesitated. "Ma'am, Sergeant Yamamoto is interrogating a captured officer. Intelligence says, I don't care. Get him here in 10 minutes or I'm pulling him out myself." Sergeant James Yamamoto arrived 12 minutes later. He was a Nisei, second-generation Japanese-American, recruited into military intelligence after spending 2 years in the Manzanar internment camp with his family. Lieutenant Callahan, O'Brien said you had an urgent situation. This woman. I need you to ask her name, medical history, when she last ate and slept. Yamamoto knelt and spoke in Japanese. The woman's eyes focused slightly. She responded in a whisper. Yamamoto's expression shifted to visible concern. Her name is Haruko Shimabukuro, 24 years old, Okinawan. She was a civilian radio operator, requisitioned by the military. She was captured near Shuri Castle 4 days ago. 4 days? Why is she just arriving here now? She was held at a forward intelligence post. They interrogated her continuously for 3 days. They believed she had knowledge of Japanese military codes. They would not let her sleep. Every time she started to lose consciousness, they would shake her awake, splash water, make loud noises. 72 hours without sleep. Francis had read about sleep deprivation. After 24 hours, cognitive function deteriorated. After 48, hallucinations began. After 72, the body started shutting down. Ask her if she told them anything. She says she knew nothing useful. She was a civilian operator with no access to military codes. But they did not believe her. When did she last eat? Yesterday morning. Ration crackers and water. Has she been allowed to sleep since arriving here? She says she is afraid to sleep. She thinks if she closes her eyes, the interrogation will start again. 4 days total without sleep. Francis conducted a rapid examination. Pulse 120 beats per minute at rest. Skin cold and clammy. Reflexes sluggish. Signs of dehydration and hypothermia. The trembling was physiological. Her core temperature had dropped below safe levels. She needs immediate intervention. Warm fluids, blankets, monitored rest. I need authorization to requisition supplies. 3 wool blankets, a field cot, a kerosene heater, and IV fluids. You'll need to clear that with Captain Morrison. Captain Robert Morrison commanded Field POW Collection Point 7B with rigid efficiency. He was 41, a veteran of World War I, promoted through steady competence. Francis stood before his desk, medical report in hand. Captain, I'm requesting authorization for medical supplies for the female prisoners. I have 1 patient in critical condition. Morrison raised his hand. Lieutenant, I've read your initial report. 12 female civilians, various minor injuries, no life-threatening conditions. Sir, my assessment has changed. Haruko Shimabukuro has been deprived of sleep for 4 days. She's showing signs of hypothermia and severe exhaustion. Without intervention, Lieutenant Callahan, this collection point holds 3,247 prisoners. We have medical supplies for approximately 2 weeks. The nearest resupply depot is 3 days away through contested territory. Every blanket, every dose of medication must be allocated strategically. Captain, the supplies I'm requesting would not impact care for American personnel. 3 blankets, a cot, and basic attention for a critically ill patient. A critically ill enemy patient. Lieutenant, these women were captured working for the Japanese military. My responsibility is to manage this facility effectively, and that means prioritizing our limited resources. The Geneva Conventions require humane treatment. Morrison's expression hardened. The Geneva Conventions were written for conventional warfare. Japan has consistently violated those conventions. The Bataan Death March, the murder of prisoners. And now you're asking me to divert resources for exceptional care when I have thousands receiving only basic subsistence. It was logical. It was also rationalization for systematic neglect. Sir, I'm asking for minimum intervention to prevent a preventable death. If she dies in our custody, it becomes evidence we are no better than the enemy we're fighting. Morrison opened a file drawer. Lieutenant, your service record shows this is not the first time you've conflicted with command over prisoners. In Guam, you requisitioned morphine for Japanese soldiers against orders. In the Philippines, you provided unauthorized care to detainees. Your efficiency ratings are excellent. Your discipline ratings are problematic. My medical oath requires me to treat all patients. Your military oath requires you to follow orders. Lieutenant Callahan, I'm denying your requisition. The female prisoners will receive the same standard care as all others. Basic food, water, and shelter. I will not authorize special provisions. Is that understood? Francis stood at attention. Yes, sir. Dismissed. She walked back through gathering darkness. April nights in Okinawa could drop to 50 degrees, cold enough for hypothermia in a patient compromised by exhaustion. Lieutenant Helen Parker met her halfway. "I heard you went to Morrison. How did it go?" "About how you'd expect. Fran, you can't save everyone. We're in the middle of the largest battle of the Pacific War. You keep fighting these battles and eventually you'll get court-martialed. So I should watch people die from preventable causes? I'm saying pick your battles. The system is bigger than both of us." They reached the tent. The 12 women sat exactly as before. No food, no water, no blankets. Haruko remained against the tent pole, trembling intensified. Frances checked her pulse. 135. Skin temperature cold. Breathing shallow. Frances made her decision. She stood and removed her uniform coat. Standard issue olive drab wool. Army regulations specified that uniform components were government property, not to be given away. Fraternization with enemy prisoners was strictly prohibited. Both regulations carried potential court-martial charges. Frances draped the coat over Haruko's shoulders. The trembling began to subside after several minutes. Haruko pulled the coat tighter. For the first time since Frances had entered the tent, the young woman made eye contact. She spoke a single word in Japanese. Yamamoto provided the meaning. "She says thank you." Frances turned to Helen, who stood with an expression of horror and admiration. "Helen, go to the medical supply tent and bring back water, food, and blankets. Don't requisition them. Just take them. Fran, if we get caught, then we get caught. But I'm not watching these women freeze because the system doesn't have procedures." Helen hesitated, then nodded. "You're going to get us both court-martialed." "Probably." Outside, night fell over Okinawa. Artillery rumbled in the distance. In the auxiliary tent, a Japanese woman and an American nurse sat together in darkness, separated by language and nationality and war, connected by the simple human reality of suffering and response. Captain Morrison learned about the coat within 3 hours. By midnight, Francis received orders to report to his office immediately. Morrison was not alone. Major Edwin Crawford sat in the second chair, the chief medical officer, a surgeon with 22 years of military service. Francis had worked under his supervision since arriving at Okinawa. Morrison spoke first. "Lieutenant Callahan, I have an incident report stating you removed your uniform coat and gave it to an enemy prisoner. Is this accurate?" "Yes, sir. Army regulations state uniform components are government property. Were you aware of this regulation?" "Yes, sir. I also have standing orders prohibiting fraternization with enemy prisoners. Were you aware?" "Yes, sir." Morrison leaned back. "Lieutenant, you directly violated regulations you knew existed. You did so less than 6 hours after I explicitly denied your requisition. What justification can you offer?" Frances chose her words carefully. "Sir, my patient was in immediate medical crisis. She was hypothermic, exhibiting cardiac irregularities. Standard treatment for hypothermia is insulation and warming. I had no blankets. I had no access to shelter. I used the only resource available, my coat. It was a medical intervention, not fraternization." Major Crawford spoke. "Lieutenant, I've read your assessment. This patient was not in imminent danger of death. She was uncomfortable and exhausted, yes. But your report does not indicate life-threatening emergency requiring immediate intervention outside protocols. With respect, Major, she had been deprived of sleep for 4 days. Sleep deprivation beyond 72 hours can cause permanent neurological damage, cardiac arrest, death. Combined with hypothermia and dehydration, her condition was critical. Your medical judgment is noted. However, the question is whether your action was medically necessary or personally motivated." There it was. When a woman showed compassion, the system questioned her motives. Morrison pulled out a form. "Lieutenant Callahan, I'm issuing an official reprimand for violation of uniform regulations and disobedience of orders. This will be placed in your permanent record. You are also restricted from prisoner enclosures without direct supervision. Your duties will be confined to treating American personnel. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir. One more thing. You will immediately retrieve your coat. Uniform property must be returned." Francis met his eyes. "Sir, if I remove the coat, the patient will likely develop severe hypothermia overnight. I cannot take an action that will directly cause medical harm." The silence stretched. "Lieutenant, that is a direct order. Sir, I am respectfully refusing to comply on grounds of medical ethics. If you want the coat removed, you'll need to order someone else. I will not. Morrison's face flushed. Lieutenant Callahan, you are dangerously close to insubordination that will result in court-martial. Francis had known this moment would come. Sir, I took an oath when I became a nurse. I swore to prevent suffering and preserve life. That oath supersedes my military obligations. If following orders requires me to cause preventable harm, I cannot follow them. Court-martial me if you must, but I will not remove that coat. Major Crawford intervened. Captain, may I suggest a compromise? Lieutenant Callahan's coat remains with the prisoner overnight for medical necessity. Tomorrow morning she retrieves it. In the interim, we requisition appropriate gear for all female prisoners through proper channels. Morrison considered. And if she refuses tomorrow? Crawford looked at Francis. She won't refuse, will you, Lieutenant? Francis understood the lifeline. No, sir. If proper gear is provided, I will retrieve the coat tomorrow. Morrison nodded slowly. Very well. Major Crawford, see that requisition is filed in the morning. Lieutenant Callahan, you are dismissed. The reprimand stands. You're restricted from prisoner areas. And if you violate another order, I will have you brought up on charges. Is that clear? Yes, sir. Francis returned to the tent at dawn. Helen had smuggled in water and rations during the night. Yamamoto had brought blankets. Small acts of resistance against systemic indifference. Haruko had finally slept. 5 hours. Not enough to reverse 4 days of deprivation, but enough to begin recovery. When Francis entered, Haruko was awake, drinking water. Through Yamamoto, Francis examined her. Pulse dropped to 95. Skin temperature normal. Trembling stopped. Cognitive function improved. Tell her the coat needs to be returned, but proper blankets have been provided. Yamamoto translated. Haruko carefully removed the coat, folded it precisely, and handed it back. She spoke in Japanese, meeting Francis's eyes. She says she understands you broke rules to help her. She says in her culture, such kindness creates an obligation that cannot be repaid. She says she will remember this always. Francis took the coat, still warm. Tell her I won't forget. Over the next 3 days, conditions improved marginally. Blankets arrived. A latrine was installed. Food distribution became regular. Francis, restricted from prisoner areas, returned to regular duties. But every evening she received updates about the women's condition. Haruko had recovered physically. Psychologically, scars would last longer. But she was alive. April 27th, 8 days after the women arrived. Francis was treating a soldier when Helen burst in. Fran, you need to come to the admin tent. Now. I'm in the middle of... One of the Japanese women is dead. They're saying it's your fault. Francis felt ice water in her veins. Which one? The older woman, the nurse, Keiko. Francis followed Helen at a run. The administrative tent was filled with officers. Morrison, Crawford, and Colonel Thomas Whitfield, an investigating officer from division headquarters. Keiko's body lay on a stretcher, covered with a blanket. She was 32, captured while treating wounded Japanese soldiers. Francis had examined her during initial screening. Bruised ribs, lacerations, but no life-threatening injuries. Colonel Whitfield looked up as Francis entered. He was in his 50s, gray-haired with the weary expression of a man who had reviewed too many deaths. Lieutenant Callahan, I'm conducting an inquiry into the death of this prisoner. Captain Morrison indicates you examined her on arrival. Yes, sir. I conducted initial screening on April 19th. What was your assessment? Francis pulled out her medical log. Multiple contusions, lacerations, possible rib fractures, mild dehydration. I recommended follow-up examination within 48 hours and monitoring for internal injuries. Was that follow-up conducted? Francis hesitated. I was restricted from prisoner areas after April 19th. I assumed routine checks were being conducted by others, but I have no direct knowledge. Whitfield turned to Morrison. Captain, was the follow-up conducted? Morrison looked uncomfortable. Sir, our medical resources are stretched thin. We have 17 personnel managing over 3,000 prisoners plus combat casualties. Routine follow-up for non-critical cases has been delayed. Delayed, I see. Major Crawford, cause of death? Crawford opened his findings. Pneumonia with bilateral pleural effusion. Fluid accumulation in the chest cavity, almost certainly secondary to the rib fractures. If she had received follow-up care, we would have identified the fluid accumulation. With proper treatment, this death was entirely preventable. The words hung in the air. Entirely preventable. Whitfield made notes. Let me understand. This prisoner arrived with injuries requiring follow-up within 48 hours. That follow-up did not occur. Over 8 days her condition deteriorated from treatable injuries to fatal pneumonia, and no one noticed she was dying until she was dead. Morrison spoke carefully. Sir, we are managing an extremely large population with inadequate resources. American casualties must be our priority. Captain, I've spent 3 days reviewing your facility. The male prisoners receive daily medical inspections. They receive treatment for routine ailments. Your logs show consistent care for the male population. Yes, sir. We've worked hard. The 12 female prisoners have received almost no attention. Apart from Lieutenant Callahan's initial examination, they were seen by medical personnel exactly twice in 8 days. Both times for emergencies, no routine checks, no follow-up care, no systematic monitoring. Morrison started to respond, but Whitfield raised his hand. Captain, I'm identifying a systemic failure. This facility, like most POW facilities in the Pacific, was designed for male prisoners. Procedures, protocols, resource allocation, everything was built assuming prisoners would be men. When women arrived, they fell through the cracks of a system that didn't account for their existence, and now one of them is dead because of that institutional blindness. Francis felt something shift. Whitfield was not blaming individuals. He was identifying the system itself as the problem. Lieutenant Callahan, I've read the incident report about the coat. I've read your complete service record. Exemplary medical care, multiple commendations, and a pattern of conflict with command over prisoner treatment. In your professional opinion, could this death have been prevented? Francis looked at Keiko's body. Yes, sir. With routine follow-up, we would have identified the effusion within 72 hours. Standard treatment would have resolved it. She would have survived. Why didn't that follow-up occur? Sir, I was restricted from prisoner areas. Other staff were not assigned to monitor the women specifically. The system assumed someone else was handling it, and so no one did. Whitfield closed his file. Here is what is going to happen. First, I'm removing the reprimand from Lieutenant Callahan's record. Her action prevented another death. Second, Captain Morrison, you will immediately establish protocols for medical care of female prisoners. Daily examinations, assigned staff, proper documentation. Third, I'm recommending to Division that all POW facilities develop specific procedures for female detainees. This pattern of neglect ends now. Morrison looked like he wanted to argue, but Whitfield's rank left no room. Yes, sir, I'll implement those protocols immediately. One more thing. Lieutenant Callahan, you're being transferred. Division is establishing a medical oversight position for prisoner care across all facilities in Okinawa. You'll inspect conditions, recommend improvements, ensure protocols are followed. Effective immediately. Francis absorbed this. Yes, sir. May I ask a question? Go ahead. The other 11 women, will they receive proper care now? That's exactly what you're going to ensure, Lieutenant. For them and for every other prisoner in the theater. Dismissed. The investigation concluded with an official finding: death by pneumonia, preventable with proper medical care, systemic failure of oversight. Keiko's body was buried in the prisoner cemetery. No ceremony, no marker, just another casualty. But her death had created a paper trail, an official investigation, a documented pattern of neglect, the kind of evidence that could not be ignored. Francis spent her last 3 days implementing new protocols, daily examinations for all prisoners, assigned medical staff, standardized documentation. It was bureaucracy fighting bureaucracy, using the system's obsession with procedure to force change. On her final evening, she received permission to visit the women's tent one last time. Yamamoto accompanied her to translate. The 11 surviving women had been moved to a proper barracks with cots, heating, and sanitary facilities. The transformation was remarkable not because it was luxurious, but because it represented the minimum standard that should have existed from the beginning. Haruko sat on her cot, reading a Japanese book Yamamoto had obtained. When Francis entered, she stood and bowed formally. Through Yamamoto, they conducted a final examination. Haruko had recovered fully from the sleep deprivation. She had gained weight. The trembling had stopped. Psychologically, she remained guarded, but that was survival instinct, not pathology. Tell her I'm being transferred. Someone else will be responsible for medical care here. But I've made sure the new protocols will continue. Yamamoto translated. Haruko listened, then responded. She says she heard about Keiko's death. She says in some ways, Keiko's death saved the rest of them. It forced the authorities to pay attention. She asks if that makes sense to you. Francis understood. One death creating documentation that prevented future deaths. It was the terrible mathematics of institutional change. Sometimes the system only responded to failure so egregious it could not be ignored. Tell her yes, I understand. And tell her I'm sorry we didn't do better sooner. Haruko spoke again, longer this time, with evident emotion. She says you did more than anyone else. She says you broke your rules to help her when no one else would. She says if circumstances were different, if there was no war, you would have been friends. She says she hopes you survive this war and return home safely. Francis felt unexpected tears. In 3 years of war, she had treated thousands of patients. But this moment, connecting across language and nationality with a woman who was supposed to be her enemy, felt more real than anything that had come before. Tell her I hope the same for her. Tell her she deserves better than any of this. They stood facing each other for a moment. Two women trapped in circumstances neither had chosen, connected by one cold night and one woolen coat. Then Francis left and walked back across the compound to pack her belongings for transfer. Division headquarters assigned Francis to medical liaison for prisoner welfare, Okinawa sector. Over the next 6 weeks, Francis inspected 17 different collection points and detention facilities. She found the same patterns. Male prisoners received adequate care. Female prisoners, when they existed, fell through procedural cracks. Not through deliberate cruelty, but through institutional blindness. She documented everything: facility conditions, medical procedures, resource allocation, and slowly, through the grinding machinery of military bureaucracy, things began to change. Standards were established. Protocols were written. Training was conducted. Francis never saw Haruko again. The 11 surviving women were transferred to Saipan in mid-May, then likely repatriated to Japan after the war ended in August. No records indicated what happened to them after repatriation. Like thousands of women whose lives intersected with war, they disappeared into historical silence. August 15, 1945. Japan surrendered. The war was over. Francis remained in Okinawa through the end of 1945. She submitted a formal inquiry trying to locate information about the 11 women. The inquiry was filed, processed, and returned with no useful information. Prisoners transferred to Saipan Detention Facility. Repatriation status unknown. Haruko Shimabukuro had vanished into the chaos. Whether she survived, whether she returned to Okinawa, whether she rebuilt her life or was destroyed by trauma, Francis would never know. In January 1946, Francis received orders to return to the United States. She continued nursing after the war, working at veterans' hospitals. She never married. She rarely spoke about her war service. In 1963, she retired with full military honors, her service record noting exemplary dedication to medical care. The reprimand had been removed, but Francis kept a copy. Sometimes she would take it out and read the words: unauthorized aid to enemy prisoner, violation of fraternization rules. Under those words, in her own handwriting, she had written a single sentence: I would do it again. The official records of World War II contain extensive documentation about prisoners in the Pacific Theater. Thousands of reports detail capture, detention, and repatriation of Japanese military personnel. Statistics track numbers, locations, and logistics with bureaucratic precision. The records about women prisoners are sparse. No comprehensive count exists of how many civilian women were captured. No systematic documentation tracks their treatment, medical care, or eventual fate. Historians estimate that between 3,000 and 5,000 Japanese and Okinawan women passed through Allied POW facilities during the Pacific War. Of these, perhaps 300 died in custody, some from combat injuries, some from disease, some from neglect. The actual numbers are unknown and likely unknowable. This pattern of historical erasure was not unique to World War II. In every conflict, women's experiences have been marginalized, underdocumented, and forgotten. The infrastructure of war, military procedure, medical protocol, resource allocation, was designed by men for men. Women existed as afterthoughts, and the historical record reflects that institutional blindness. Army Nurse Corps officers did serve in POW facilities. They did challenge command decisions. They did face discipline for providing care the system deemed unauthorized. Okinawan women were conscripted as civilian auxiliaries. They operated radios, treated wounded, and performed administrative duties. When captured, they received inadequate care in facilities unprepared for their existence. Some died. Most survived and returned to lives the historical record never documented. The code is real. Not the specific code, but the act it represents. Individual humanity resisting institutional indifference. Small acts of compassion that violated regulations, but saved lives. These moments happened repeatedly throughout the war, performed by nurses and doctors and ordinary soldiers who recognized that following orders sometimes meant allowing preventable suffering. Most of these acts were never documented. They happened in tents and field hospitals and detention facilities, witnessed by people who left no written records. One coat on one cold night became the catalyst for institutional change that affected thousands of lives. But how many other coats were there? How many other acts of quiet defiance went unrecorded? How many women survived or died in circumstances history never bothered to document? After the war, the Geneva Conventions were revised. The 1949 version included extensive provisions for the treatment of women prisoners and civilian detainees. It specified medical care requirements, facility standards, and protection from exploitation. These provisions were written in response to documented failures during World War II, failures that cost lives and violated fundamental principles of human dignity. Frances Callahan's legacy was not heroism, but documentation. She created a paper trail that could not be ignored. She testified to patterns of neglect. She provided evidence that forced institutional recognition of systemic failure. That bureaucratic persistence saved more lives than any single act of individual courage. Haruko Shimabukuro's legacy is silence. She left no written record. Her name appears in no history books. She is one of thousands of women whose war experiences were never considered worthy of documentation. But she survived, and her survival mattered. This is the story of a coat. This is the story of institutional neglect and individual resistance. This is the story of women whose experiences were marginalized by history because the systems that documented war were built without them in mind. Most of all, this is the story of how change happens, not through grand gestures or moral victories, but through the accumulated weight of documented failures that become impossible to ignore. One death creating investigation, one investigation creating policy, one policy affecting thousands of lives. Lieutenant Frances Callahan and Haruko Shimabukuro met for a few days in April 1945. They shared no common language. They were supposed to be enemies. But in the space between regulations and humanity, they connected. That connection was documented, and that documentation created change. The code is long gone. The women are dead or forgotten, but the documentation remains. Fragments preserved in military archives. Evidence that people tried to do better even when the system made it difficult. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, those fragments are enough to prove that individual choices matter, that documented actions create change, and that refusing to accept institutional indifference is both possible and necessary. That is the story. That is the truth. That is what remains when all else is forgotten. If this story of courage, compassion, and the forgotten women of war moved you, please consider subscribing to our channel. We uncover the hidden narratives of history, the stories that were deliberately or accidentally erased from official records, the voices that were silenced by institutional blindness, the acts of humanity that occurred in the darkest moments of human conflict. Hit the like button if you believe these stories deserve to be remembered and shared. Every like helps this video reach more people who need to hear about Lieutenant Frances Callahan's choice and Haruko Shimabukuro's survival. And most importantly, leave a comment below. Tell us, have you encountered similar stories of women whose contributions were overlooked by history? Do you know of nurses, soldiers, prisoners, or civilians whose experiences deserve recognition? What other untold stories from World War II should we investigate next? Your engagement doesn't just support this channel, It ensures that the forgotten voices of history continue to be heard. One comment, one share, one subscription becomes part of the documentation that prevents these stories from disappearing entirely. Subscribe now so you never miss when we release the next chapter of hidden history, because some stories are too important to remain buried in forgotten archives. Thank you for watching, for remembering, and for helping us preserve the truth of what really happened.